stage. Shall we give Steve a hand for wonderful playing this evening? Thank you, Steve. Well, let me give you a warm welcome to City Gates Church this evening. It's great to see a really good crowd here. If it's your first time with us, we hope you'll feel especially welcome. My name is Bev Dubberly. I'm on the staff team of the church here, and it's my privilege to welcome you to this event. So this is the first of 3 events that we have over this weekend, our More to Life weekend. I'll be telling you a little bit more about the other events later, but you should see on your tables there's flyers there for you to look. So we hope we whet your appetite tonight. Tonight we are thrilled to have Professor Richard Bugg with us. You may have heard of Richard. You might have heard him on your radio, on your TV screens. Richard's often speaking about things like ash dieback and elms. We're so glad that he's here. He has research groups at Queen Mary University in London and at Kew Gardens, where they are analysing the DNA of plants and looking to see how they are adapting to different diseases and climate change. So it's really great to have him with us tonight to learn and hear from him about his work. In a moment, Ralph is going to come and interview him, and then Richard will be giving us a talk and helping us to think through whether science can point to God. And I want to just say, if you are someone here in the room who feels a bit cynical about that, and perhaps you think it's the opposite, and perhaps you think that no progress in science actually leads us away from a belief in divine, in a creator, that's fine. If you feel like you're in a church and you can't really disagree, please don't feel like that. We would love some healthy debate. We're going to have a Q&A session after Rich has talked, and he is very happy to engage with any of your questions within the scope of this topic. We're going to have a little QR code come up on the screen now. This is a Slido app. If you're not familiar with it and you've got a phone with you, go onto your camera and zoom in on this QR code, and it will take you through to the Slido app. And there you can type in any questions that you have, and they will all come up anonymously to Richard, and Ralph will be handling the Q&A time later in the evening. We'll bring it up again a little bit later, but if you've got questions, put them in on there. Okay, well, let's welcome Richard and Ralph. Please do come up.
Okay, right. Well, I think it's time to be able to hand over to you and let you answer the question. Can science point
Richard.
the way to doctor?
Sorry.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ralph. Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, yeah. So what we're going to do then is, if we can we just have the Slido app, whatever it is, thing back up again? Yep. Okay. And if you can take a photo of that, or whatever you do with it, with your photo thingy, to get on the website, and we'll be able to pick up things as we go along. Please, just write down any questions that you might have in this field, and also have a look and see what other people have put down there, because it's quite interesting. If you see a question somebody else has asked, then just add yourself to it, and obviously we can go for the high density questions, so to speak, when we're pushed for time on the Q&A. But for now, please, Professor Richard Bugg.
Thank you very much. Well, thanks very much for having me, and thank you for coming this evening to listen to whether or not I think that science can point to God. And it's probably not a secret that I'm going to say yes. I think it does. I doubt if I'd have been invited, actually, if I was going to say no. Over the last few decades, science has made tremendous progress. And I just want to talk about 3 areas of scientific discovery just to kick off this talk. The first one is the discovery of the software that we have in our DNA. So as you'll all know, the human genome is 3.2 billion letters of DNA long. Ash trees, which I study a lot, are 880 million bases of DNA. Birch trees are more like 350 million bases of DNA. And that DNA is encoding the software of life. It's the software that we run on. And we spend a huge amount of our time trying to figure out how it works. And here's, it's very hard to see this on the size of the screen, but this is a genome browser, which is something that we use to look at the genomes and highlight where there are genes that are coding for proteins, and then try and work out how they're controlled and what they're doing. I could spend the rest of my career trying to understand the software of an ash tree, and I can assure you I would get nowhere close to understanding all of it. The human genome has had billions and billions of pounds spent on it. Thousands of highly intelligent people have studied it. We've invested a huge amount, and we are still discovering new things about how it works, and still nobody can explain all of it to us. Still, we're just looking at the tip of the iceberg in the complexity of the software that we run on. In addition to DNA, we also now understand much more about what is going on within living cells. So here I'm showing you a simulation of what a leaf looks like in great detail. Here we're at the level where you could see it under a light microscope. These are the chloroplasts where photosynthetic activity takes place. And these are the thylakoid membranes. And now we're getting to the point where a light microscope can't resolve what's here. You can only see these things under an electron microscope. And we have tiny motors called ATP synthase. These are running on a flow of ions going across a gradient. They're hydrogen ions. And as they go, it's a bit like a turbine. The flow of the ions is causing that rotation. It's rotating at about 140 times a second. And every time it rotates, it takes in 3 molecules of something called ADP, and it spits out 3 molecules of something called ATP. And that is how energy is moved around in the cell, and other cellular processes are powered. That is the most amazing piece of nanotechnology. You know, humans can make nanotechnology in a lab, but nothing that we make is half as sophisticated as the molecular machinery of life that are in every cell. So I have trillions of these, you have trillions of these, every plant does, bacteria have them too. Life runs partly through this machine, ATP synthase. The person who first discovered the structure of this got the Nobel Prize, and it is the most amazing piece of machinery. Here's something quite similar. It's called the bacterial flagellum. It's a kind of outboard motor, and it's how bacteria move through aqueous media. And here it is, again running on a flow of ions, rotating extremely fast, and the hair-like structure that it drives makes a kind of turbine as it turns in the media. Here's another picture of the workings of the motor. Here's another one. Sorry, I went a bit overboard on the animations. And it even has this little extra gear, and it can stop rotating in one direction and turn in a different direction in a split second, because it's got this incredible little gearing structure that just moves across and makes it go the other way. Here's a close-up of that gear. As I say, this is so small that you can only see this under an electron microscope. This is at the nano scale. And it's this kind of machinery that we now know life runs on. We didn't used to know that, now we do. The human brain. I think everyone has always marveled at the human brain. A few years ago, the European Union gave a huge amount of money to a group of scientists to try to recreate the brain in a computer. 600 million euros, the Human Brain Project. And then when it wrapped up, Nature, the world's leading science journal, did an article about it. Scientists aimed to recreate the brain in a computer. How did it go? The answer was basically they couldn't do it. With 600 million euros, all of the computer power they needed, lots of intelligent people, they couldn't simulate the human brain on a massive computer. We still don't fully understand how the brain works. And we have to ask ourselves, well, where does all of this come from? Science is discovering more and more complexity and sophistication and just awesome detail within life. How did it get here? And that's not just a question that someone like me wants to ask. If you watch the BBC documentary Universe that came out in 2021, I think it's still on iPlayer, Professor Brian Cox brings up this issue. Everywhere you look on Earth, there is complexity. So you have to ask yourself, how can it be that such complexity can emerge completely naturally in the universe? Where does this complexity come from? And I think for most of us, there's a very simple answer because, okay, DNA is software, basically. We sometimes see software being produced, and we know that when software is produced, there is an intelligent person, or more often than not, a large group of very intelligent people, all working together to write a piece of software. We know that writing software requires intelligence wherever we see software being made in life today. So the natural answer we come to when we see software and ask where did it come from is, well, it must have an intelligent source. And we know that making good software is so difficult that we're always having to download patches and updates because of problems that people have found in the software that they've made. We don't get the opportunity to do that with our genomes. We just have to make do with what we have. And it's amazing how well it works. Well, that's software. How about... and I have another... Wait a minute. I have another slide here. You know, if you were walking along a beach and you saw a very simple piece of code, you just saw hello written out in pebbles, you would immediately infer that an intelligent agent had been there. You'd immediately know a human being had walked along there and put those pebbles into that bit of code. Well, how much more when you see 3.2 billion bases of a genome all strung together inside a human being. Nanotechnology. Been talking about the amazing nanotechnology in our cells. Well, we know that any example of nanotechnology that we see today made before us is made by human beings. Again, large teams of very intelligent people working together to make nanotechnology. We can very quickly discern whether we think something is designed by human beings or not. You know, here are two rock formations, both made of arches. It takes you a split second to look at the top one and think, that's probably natural, and to look at the bottom one and think, that was probably caused by intelligent agents. You know, it's a very simple inference that we make in our everyday lives. We're constantly looking at things and asking, was that made by an intelligence, or did it happen by chance? You know, imagine that my wife and I came down to our living room one morning, and we knew that when we went to bed, our children's Brio set had been all packed away in the bag it normally lives in. But we went down one morning, and on the floor, all of the pieces in the bag were out on the floor, and in the middle was this, a circle made of Brio train track with a little truck on the top. We would look at that and think, well, somebody must have done that. If I said to my wife, I think that happened by chance, you know, I think the bag just fell over and those 8 pieces just happened to fall like that, and this truck landed on top of them, she would say, you must be crazy, you know, somebody must have been here, somebody must have done that. And I would have a very difficult job persuading her that happened by chance. It would seem to be crazy. You know, even if I said, well, maybe there are billions and billions of sets of Brio in the world, and we just happen to have the one that fell like that, she would still think, you know, you are crazy. That must have been designed. It must have been done by a human being. You know, if it wasn't our kids, it must have been a thief who broke in and liked playing with Brio. It must have been an intelligence. Well, applying that very simple logic to what we see in biology strongly suggests to us there is an intelligence behind what we see. And although I'm arguing this from new scientific discoveries like software and DNA and nanomachines. This is a point that people have been making for a very long time down throughout human history. So back in about 300 BC, so I'm wondering if, great. There was an argument between two Greek philosophers, Democritus and Socrates. And Democritus was arguing that everything could have come about by chance. Socrates was saying, well, let's look at a statue. As soon as I look at a statue, and of course at the time making lifelike human statues of the human form was the height of sophistication and modernity. If I look at a statue, immediately I admire the skill and the artistry of the craftsman who made the statue, of the sculptor. Well, how much more should I admire the skill and the artistry of the one who made actual living, breathing human beings that the sculpture is simply recreating the shape of in a piece of stone? And so Socrates was using this as an argument for the existence of God. Democritus, on the other hand, was saying, well, it all just happened by chance. You know, maybe the universe is infinitely large and infinitely old, and we just happen to be at that place where atoms have just come together in a way that makes life possible. It's a bit like me saying, let's imagine there are billions and billions of sets of Brio, and we happen to have the one where they just all happen to fall out of the bag as into that perfect circle. And so Socrates was wielding this argument from design against Democritus's argument against God's existence. And the Cambridge classicist David Sedley has thought quite deeply about why Socrates was making this argument. And he says, well, Socrates was the first one to sort of write this down in a philosophical form. But the only reason why he had to do that was because Democritus was arguing against it. And actually before that, everyone constantly, just uniformly, looked at the natural world and inferred this must have been designed. They didn't need a formal argument from a Greek philosopher to back that up. The Greek philosopher was only needed when another Greek philosopher was contradicting that idea that most people found intuitive. And indeed we see that, for example, hundreds of years before Socrates, the psalmist in the Bible. Could I have the next slide, please? I think that my clicker has given up. The biblical psalmist says, I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. He's looking at his own body and thinking, this is so amazing. God must have created me. I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. And I think that is something that's so intuitive to all of us and has been to all humans through history. And it was written down by Socrates as a philosophical argument in 300 BC. So I think that today, that argument is simply turbocharged by the findings of modern science. I think it was a powerful argument when Socrates made it. It was a powerful argument when the psalmist made it. Today, it's even more powerful because we know so much more about the complexity of our bodies and the complexity of other living things as well. Now, some of you I know are thinking, but wait a minute. We've also discovered by science how we can explain all of this away, and we can do that by evolution. So I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, well, what about evolution? Could I have the next slide, please? And indeed, when Brian Cox asks the question, where does complexity come from, in his BBC documentary, he immediately goes to evolution. Thankfully, he's fairly honest about the origin of life. No one knows exactly how life on Earth emerged, but what we do know is that at some point, primitive cells living in the ocean began using the sun's energy to power life-giving chemical reactions. This process, known as photosynthesis, unleashed the sun's creative power and drove the evolution of complexity from primitive bacteria to plants and trees, and ultimately to you and me. There's a part of that photosynthetic machinery. Everything you see here, every plant on the planet's got a photosystem too. It's composed of 46,630 atoms all working together in an intricate machine. very efficient. How do we explain it? He just says it took billions of years of evolution. So he's very clearly telling us evolution is how it got here, but he's giving us frustratingly little detail. I think you'll agree. He's giving us quite a hand-wavy explanation. We have to look to someone like Richard Dawkins to give us a bit more detail about how the evolutionary process works. And he says, I could not imagine being an atheist at any point before 1859 when Darwin's Origin of Species was published. Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. And the reason why it wasn't possible to be an atheist before then, according to Dawkins, is because of this argument from design. Because before Darwin, according to Dawkins, there simply was no other explanation for the design, the appearance of design, as he calls it, of living things, except for a divine superintelligence. And so clearly he doesn't find Democritus's argument that it could have all happened purely by chance convincing. He dismisses that. He says we can't just appeal to luck to explain how we got here. That's very unsatisfying. Can't be an intellectually fulfilled atheist before Darwin. And why is it that Darwin makes it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist? Well, because he gets rid of this problem of luck. What is it that makes natural selection succeed as a solution to the problem of improbability? The problem of improbability, that's another way of saying things look designed. The answer is that natural selection is a cumulative process which breaks down the problem of improbability up into small pieces. Each of the small pieces is slightly improbable, but not prohibitively so. So, to go back to my analogy of this piece of brio, if I say all of this happened in one go purely by chance, you'll say, no, it's too improbable. Can't believe that could have happened. But what if I say, well, okay, let's imagine I come downstairs in the morning and there are two pieces together, just two pieces lying together on the floor. And I say to my wife, I think it's just pure chance that those two pieces just happen to land in just the right way and join together. I think my wife would say, okay, I can believe that. It's quite chancy. I mean, it's quite lucky that they happen to land both together, but it's not so lucky that I can't believe it. You know, I don't have to believe a robber entered the room in order to explain why two pieces got stuck together. Maybe it's 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000 chance that happened, but I can believe it could have happened by chance. So what Richard Dawkins says is, well, the way evolution works is instead of saying all 8 pieces got together all in one go, 2 pieces got together, but then there was a process that said a longer track is better than a shorter one. Let's imagine that's a kind of rule. And so something says, well, these two, they stay together once they're together. And then we keep throwing about the brio train set. And then maybe after 10,000 throws, another one, purely by chance, might join. And again, you know, quite lucky, but not so lucky that you find it impossible to believe. And then there's this rule, which is natural selection, that says, well, that's slightly better, so let's keep that. And then do the same thing over again. By chance, after a while, another bit gets added. The rule says, okay, that's slightly better, keep that, that stays together, and so on. If there's a process like that, then you can kind of believe that, well, eventually, yeah, you would build up the whole thing. And this is the essence of Richard Dawkins' argument. This is the essence of why people think that evolution has explained away God. That apparently you can now explain complex things, but you've just broken them down into lots of tiny steps. Now, it's very important to note that in this process, every step has to be functional and slightly better than the one before. If it's not, you've got a problem, because natural selection has got to say, that is a bit better, keep that, don't keep the other thing, keep this new thing. And that's how you gradually build up more and more complexity. And that sounds very compelling when you think about it in a sort of literally a toy example like a brio train set. But actually, any of you who've built a brio train set of any complexity at all, and now if I could have the next slide, please. sorry. And so, sorry, just go back to Richard Dawkins. So he's really keen to stress, luck is not the issue. We're not just appealing to huge amounts of luck. Natural selection helps us to move away from huge amounts of luck, and that's why it's so compelling. But actually, when you think about it, quite a lot of luck is needed, even in that process. So, for example, if I want to get anything that is more simple, more complex than just a circle, let's imagine I want to have a bridge in this train set so that I can start having some loops going under another one. Well, before I can get a bridge, I need this piece to fall in. So purely by chance, this one has to fall in. But then once I've got that one, I can't have any old piece coming in after that. I've got to have this piece. That is the only option. Of all my hundreds of pieces, it has to be this particular one. Obviously, that is a lot less probable than just any old piece landing. And then once I've got that one, I have to have this particular piece. And so the probability of me making this structure, that takes a lot of luck, doesn't it, to get that forming. I've got to have all those pieces coming in exactly the right sequence, one after the other, and not have another one sort of interfering in the process, and then I end up with a non-functional track with a big jump in it. Similarly, if I've got a perfect circle, I can't get any better than that without breaking up that circle. But if I break up that circle, I'm going backwards. And natural selection isn't going to want to do that. So the only way I can go backwards is by chance. And then maybe if I go backwards, then I can get in a little piece like this, a junction that would enable me to get more sophisticated again. And so the Darwinian process does require more luck than you might think at first go to build up any kind of complexity. And if you want a train set like this, I think if any of you have tried to make a train set like this for your kids, you'll know that you often have to go forwards and then backwards, forwards then backwards to get the whole thing to work together. It's not something that is easy to build up by a step-by-step process, every bit of which is just by chance, every small step purely by chance. But actually, when one reads Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, you find that he still, despite the Darwinian mechanism, he still has to appeal to vast amounts of luck when he starts talking about how we got here. The print is too small for me to read through it for you, but basically he appeals to pure luck for the origin of life. He says you have to have an initial stroke of luck for the origin of life, because until you've got life, you can't have this process of natural selection happening at all. And today we know that even the simplest life forms are hugely complex. And then he goes on to say, well, probably the origin of the eukaryotic cell and the origin of consciousness and maybe some other bits are also, we just have to appeal to pure luck for them as well. And the way we do it is by appealing to the idea that the universe is very large and there are billions of planets like ours. So he's basically, despite himself, despite saying the wonderful thing about Darwinism is it gets us away from luck, he ends up going back to luck to explain some of the major innovations in life. And actually it's worse for him than it was for Democritus, because Democritus thought the universe was infinitely large and infinitely old, whereas everyone today doesn't believe that. We believe the universe had a beginning and it's finite in size. And so I find it very unsatisfying to think that Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist because he got rid of the need of huge amounts of luck, but then we actually do need to appeal to huge amounts of luck to explain some of the really major innovations in life. And the other thing you have to remember is the Darwinian process requires that every step in the production of something new is a small change that makes something slightly better and it functions. It's very hard to think how you could build up a structure like this, step by tiny step, where every step has a slightly improved function. Just building something out of Lego, it's very hard to have something that is functional at every step. Imagine trying to build this where every step has to have a function. And actually, this structure, the bacterial flagellum, has come under huge attention from evolutionary biologists. Back in the 90s, a biochemist in the States suggested that he basically said, nobody knows how this evolved, and I don't think they ever will. And so, of course, a lot of people have been trying to explain it. And if you follow what happened, after a while they said, well, we found an intermediate form. It's called the type 3 secretory system. It looks a bit like the flagellum, but it doesn't rotate, and all it does is inject something from the bacteria into another cell. But looking at it, it looks similar enough to this being a sort of intermediate form. And admittedly, just one intermediate form among what would have to be many thousands of intermediate forms, but something that looks like an intermediate form. Well, as science progressed, we got to understand the structure of these things a lot more, and the similarity became more and more superficial, and the sophistication of both of them became more and more evident. And actually today, most biologists think that the type 3 secretory system actually evolved from the flagellum. So the more complex thing was there first, and the simpler thing was derived from it. And so again, the progress of science has moved us away from something that looked like maybe a sort of plausible evolutionary intermediate, away from that to something that in fact isn't. Charles Darwin himself said in The Origin of Species, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down, but I can find no such case. But I think today we can say, well, we do find such cases. Nobody can even imagine a step-by-step process where everything is formed by numerous successive slight modifications, each of which can be selected for by natural selection. No one can think of that for ATP synthase. No one can think of that for the bacterial flagellum. No one can think of that for photosystem 2, which Brian Cox refers to. You know, maybe Darwin's theory does break down at that point. You might think, well, surely someone like Brian Cox knows that. So why does he still believe it? You have to look really closely at what he says when he asks the question in his documentary. He says, how can such complexity emerge completely naturally in the universe? And notice what he's doing there. He's saying the only answer that I'm happy with is an answer that is true. I don't want, he's saying, an answer that is supernatural. So he's basically ruling out God from the outset. He's saying God can't be the answer to the question. I have to have an answer that gives me this complexity completely naturally. And of course, if that's your stipulation, then you have to have some kind of evolutionary explanation, because God, by definition, is supernatural. And so it's really the way the question is being asked in science that is limiting us, so that people have to think in terms of an evolutionary mechanism. God is being ruled out from the outset in a philosophical way. He's not being ruled out by the science itself. So in conclusion, very simply, complexity in the living world points to God more powerfully than ever before. The age-old argument from design has not been refuted by Darwin. Recent scientific discoveries point to God. We have more evidence for God's existence today than we've ever had before, and it's science that has given us that. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Richard, for giving us a lot to think about. I think you did a good job of, there were some things I understood in that talk, which was great. But yeah, thank you. Lots for us to consider. I hope you got the Slido thing. If you didn't, perhaps we could just pop that up again. You might want to refresh your page if it didn't work the first time for you. We're going to go through some of the questions with Richard in a moment. But let me just tell you about a couple of other things as well while you're here. First of all, as you go out of the door and you leave this evening, there is a little book table there. And if you would like to explore this question a little bit more, there are some books there. There's a couple that are specialist ones on science, but there's also some on just good questions, real answers to life's big questions. So if any of this has provoked a curiosity or an interest to find out more about God, please do just help yourself to these. There's one there, there's one that just gets to the heart of what Christianity is. All of those books are free, so please do help yourself to them. We'd also love to invite you to our next Hope Explore course, which is an informal opportunity. We run these every term. They're just opportunities to come and ask, again, the big questions in life. And our next course starts in April. You'll be very welcome to come along to that. I'm just going to show you a short trailer for that now.
Emotions more
Have we got
powerful
sound?
than hope. It's a spark inside you that brings a smile to your lips, a light that shows on your face, a feeling that lifts your head and pulls you forward. These days, hope like that often feels hard to come by. Maybe you've experienced your share of disappointments, but real hope is what the Christian faith claims to offer. A joyful expectation for the future, based on true events in the past, which changes everything about my present. Hope Explored is a 3-session series for anyone who is looking for a hope worth having. Whatever you do or don't believe, this is your invitation to explore, to discuss, to question, to discover. This is Hope Explored.
Okay, so you're most welcome to come to that. No qualifications for joining us on that course. You don't need to have any knowledge of the Bible, anything about God. Come with your questions. Come and explore with us. We'd love you to join us. We're going to have a short break now. There are some more drinks out of the door if you'd like one. Get your questions in, and then in just a couple of minutes, we're going to start our Q&A.
Okay. We just want to try and make the most of the rest of our time before we close tonight. So thank you very much for everybody who's either asked a question or added to a question. We obviously won't be able to get through all of these, but I think it's probably important perhaps to start with. There's a question here that says, if what you say is so easy and clear, why do others still question it?
Yeah, good question. I think it's partly the philosophical presupposition that Brian Cox kind of smuggles into his question. You know, I only want a natural explanation. Anything supernatural is just kind of ruled out from the outset. And that means we're not following the evidence wherever it leads. We're constraining what the answers can be. I think it's also because it's quite scary when you think about it. If you think there really is a being who has designed the world around me, you know, who was actually powerful enough and intelligent enough to design a human being, that is quite a terrifying thought, really. I mean, that is truly awe-inspiring intelligence and power. And to think that such a person could exist, it has to be a life-changing thought. I mean, if there is such a person, then life is very different to if there's not. And that means that we have to change not just the way we think about how we got here, but so much about how we live our lives and how we think about life. And I think it's scary. It genuinely is a scary thing to think about, if that's true. And I think that also is a big factor. It's bound up with so many other questions that it's truly life-changing to change your mind on that.
Okay, thank you. Question here, we've got a lot of people who've asked, do you reject the process of evolution entirely?
No, not at all. So this is what I spend my time researching. So, for example, for my postdoc, I was studying a new species that arose about 100 years ago, saying, you've got to believe this, you've just got to believe this. You have to believe that the bacterial flagellum must have evolved by an undirected natural process that had no goal in mind. And my question is, well, where's the evidence for that? That's a very counterintuitive thing to believe. And I'm not seeing strong evidence that anyone can even imagine how it could have happened. And so if the evidence was strong, then of course I would consider it, and if it was compelling, I would believe it, no doubt. And so don't mishear me as saying no evolution happens. I'm not saying that. Where there's good evidence for it, I'm happy to believe in it. But don't either mishear me as saying evolution explains how we got here, because I don't think the evidence is strong for that either. And in some ways, the word evolution itself is a bit unhelpful here, because if I ask a colleague in science what is evolution, they'll say change in allele frequencies in a population over time. That's the kind of standard definition. That's changes in the frequencies of variations of genes in a population. And so if over a generation the number of people with red hair in London increases, that's evolution, because the allele frequencies have changed. And of course, you can't not believe in that. It's just such a clear and self-evident truth that happens, that you can't not believe in that. On the other hand, the same word evolution is used for a purposeless natural process that did not have us in mind and is invoked to explain everything about how we got here. Those two are very, very different things, but the word evolution is used for both of them. And so it's a very ambiguous word, unhelpfully ambiguous.
Okay. And how do you, as a scientist, explain the supernatural events around Jesus' life?
The way I approach them is to look at the evidence in front of me, basically. I think being a scientist is about following the evidence wherever it leads. And so when I read one of this gospel, and I read the account, Jesus turning water into wine, I'm thinking, do I think this is reliable eyewitness testimony? Is this good evidence? I think there are lots of things about the way John and Matthew, Mark and Luke are written that strongly suggest it is eyewitness evidence of real events. And then I look at what happened around the circumstances, and Jesus does the miracle in a very interesting way. There's these empty pots. He asks some servants to fill up the pots with water. So that obviously takes them quite a long time, because they have to have smaller vessels full of water to fill up these bigger jars. They can't just take the jars out. The jars are these big stationary objects. Everyone would have taken water out of them when they entered to wash. Then Jesus gets some servants to fill it back up so they know it's water. And then he does a kind of blind test, which I quite like as a scientist, that he tells the servants, now take some of that to the master of the feast. And the master of the feast has no idea what's going on. He just says, that's amazing wine. He's not in on it. And there's something very convincing about that. And then the way people react is also interesting, that some people think, wow, this is amazing. Some people just kind of dismiss it. And it just strikes me, yeah, I think that is what would happen if something like that happened. And then Jesus replicates it in the same place later. He does another miracle where he heals a servant at a distance, somebody at a distance. Can't remember if it's a servant or a son. And some servants of a man they meet the man and they tell him, your son is healed. And he says, at what time was he healed? And they say at 1:00. And the man knew that it was at 1:00 that Jesus had said it. So again, you've got this situation where one group of people are blind to the fact a miracle is meant to have happened. Another person who is able to take that data and say, well, that was a miracle. And so you get this replication of two events that are quite different, but you have these similar aspects of a supernatural event and independent witnesses of it. And as a scientist, I find that very compelling. Obviously, it's not the same as Jesus doing it in front of me, but then I can hardly expect that. But weighing up the historic evidence, I find it pretty compelling. And if these claims about Jesus were not true, and particularly if he didn't rise from the dead, why did Christianity take off in the first century under intense persecution in the Roman Empire? It just doesn't make sense. If all of that were lies that people had invented, how would it ever have got any traction whatsoever? You know, the gospel authors, they're talking about people, they're talking about places, they're talking about times. It's all testable. If you were there in the first century, you could find someone from that place and say, did that happen? And if you found out, no, it didn't happen, you'd say, well, this whole thing about Jesus is just made up. And so I think there's a really strong objective case that this is real. Can I explain how the miracles happen? No, of course I can't. The whole point of a miracle is that it is beyond nature. It's beyond what we can study in science. If I could explain it away, it wouldn't be a miracle. You know, that's the whole point. And I think, sorry, I'm going on a bit.
That's all right.
But I think to say I don't believe in miracles, they're unscientific. I think that's a philosophical position, but it's not really a scientific position. I think as a scientist, you should be saying, what's the evidence? And if it's telling me something surprising, then I'm willing to be surprised.
Okay, thank you, Richard. We're nearly out of time. I'm sorry we haven't got time to go through all of these, but I know Richard's happy to hang around for a little bit, sure. and if you want to come up and ask him a question individually, then please do. But I'm going to ask us one more question. You've talked about why this is all rational, why you think there's evidence that's historical, but at the heart of it, why are you a Christian?
Well, as I've explained in the talk, I think there's really strong evidence from current science today that God exists. And so then you have to ask, well, if there is such a God, if I'm persuaded by that, and he's so powerful and he's made us, has he tried to communicate with us in other ways? And there are various claims that say this is communication from God. I think when we weigh them up, the Bible is the most compelling one, and particularly the person of Jesus coming to earth to reveal God to us. There's so much that is unique about Jesus. No other religion has a figure that's even comparable to Jesus. You know, even if you read the Quran, you read claims about Jesus that are not made about anyone else. That he was born of a virgin, that he's still alive, that he's coming back to judge the earth. You know, Jesus is just a completely unique person among any other claim of the revelation of God. And I think all of us admire his moral teaching. You know, atheist or theist, it doesn't really matter. Everyone can see that his moral teaching is beyond comparison. And so and then the start of John's Gospel, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Through him everything was made. That just fits so well with a world where we're inferring there must have been a mind before matter, that intelligence must have designed and made these things. And John is telling me, well, that is the Word that was with God, and that is Jesus. And then the person of Jesus, so unique. I think it all just hangs together so beautifully in one whole. And that's why I'm a Christian rather than any other theistic religion.
Professor Richard Bugg, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just before you go, a couple of things. Richard was just mentioning the evidence for Christianity. There's an opportunity for you to look at that if that's new to you, or perhaps it's not so new, but you didn't actually realise that there are eyewitness accounts written about Jesus, his life and his teaching. Here's John's Gospel, Richard was quoting from that just now. There's a pile of them outside on the table. Why not take one and have a look, have a fresh look? It's been brilliant having you with us tonight. We would love to invite you back to our next couple of events. So tomorrow evening, you'll see on your flyer here, we have Debbie Flood, who's a four-time Olympian and British champion rower. And she's going to be coming and sharing about what it has been like to be in elite sport the pressures of that, the pressures and the impact on your identity. And she's going to be sharing what it has meant to be a Christian in the midst of that world. She's a really fascinating speaker, so I'd love to invite you to return again tomorrow evening at 7:30 and come and listen to her. You don't have to be into sport. She's just a really interesting person to listen to, and the kind of things she's talking about transfer across into all areas of life. And then on Sunday, here at 9:30 and at 11:15 in the morning, we have our normal morning services. We're going to be thinking about the topic of what is the point in life. So if that's something that you would like to come and explore, you'd be very welcome. We'd love to see you at either of those services. They will be the same, so the 9:30 repeated at 11:15. It would be great to see you there. We're also here every Sunday. You're always welcome. 9:30, 11:15 or 6 o'clock. Come and see. Great to have you with us. Hope you enjoyed our evening. Do come and speak to Richard. And good night.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.